Hi, I'm Keith, and are you ready to Fleet Geek out? We're going to focus on apps today and go over the world of apps for dedicated devices in large fleets and the considerations across the board when you look at your strategy for building your app and the importance of the app of delivering the experience to either a consumer or an employee as you build your business around Android dedicated device fleets with Esper. Hi, I'm Keith Szot, VP of Innovation and Solutions at Esper, and you're watching Fleet Geek. Build your dedicated device fleet your way. When you look at creating the experience through dedicated devices, there are many important aspects of the solution that you're trying to create, right? Cloud, super important. You have the device with the configuration that you deliver to the device that needs to be very precise, and that's where we come in, of course. But a key point here is whatever you're creating, the app is the center point of delivering the experience to the human. And so when you look at dedicated devices, you have to really think about the app itself and what you're trying to do. So you're literally creating that experience for the target user. What are you trying to do with that experience? How does it fit into your business model? How are you trying to monetize it? How are you trying to measure it? These are all very, very important considerations as you consider your app strategy for dedicated devices. Now, why do I talk about dedicated devices? Because really it's different than your traditional app development that you see for the consumer or the enterprise space. You are literally using this to payload a core part of your business strategy, whether it's operationally oriented or engaging directly with your end customer to monetize. And so you have to take a different perspective on it. And then there's also the technology stack that's associated with it. This is going to be driven by your cloud, right? So you have to consider how these two pieces fit together. It's going to be very centered on the device. And so there are definitely technology and design considerations that come into play there. And then, of course, you have to think about your target user. Who are they? How do they understand participating in this dedicated device experience? And what kind of experience, therefore, do you need to deliver? Simple example, seniors with remote patient monitoring are much different than dropping a kiosk into an avant-garde, fashion-oriented retail store. So it starts on what do you want to draw from the cloud? This can also relate to operational considerations. You know, as a simple example, when we talk about Esper with DevOps for devices, one of the key capabilities that we offer is the ability to create pipelines to roll out apps. Well, there's also the rollback scenario. And so if your app is not working as you intended as you roll it out to the field based on your telemetry, you're going to want to roll it back. For better or for worse, the Android app install model is structured such that if you roll forward, your app cache is preserved, all your login information and app data is kept. But if you roll back, you're essentially uninstalling that current version and going back to an old version, and that means your app cache is flushed. The way that you can get around this is to keep that related user data, app cache data in the cloud, and have a scheme that you can refresh it back to your app if you do a rollback. That requires system design. It's a different story for Esper Foundation, actually, because we can take care of that for you within the OS itself. It goes back to why we built Foundation, because we're addressing a lot of these dedicated device scenarios that are not typically addressed by the Android OS itself. So you have multiple choices, but the point being here is that you have to think that through as you go into your design phase. Another area of consideration is, well, what platforms do you need to support? I guess what operating systems you need to support. So if you need to go cross-platform and you're building something that you need to payload on iOS or even Windows or Chrome, in addition to Android, you might look at some of these cross-platform technologies like Xamarin, Maui, Fuchsia. So that is a very important key consideration, but the note is you're going to get LCD, least common denominator, typically. I actually had a friend who was in the industry who went through this very experience, And they started with cross-platform, but when they really got into what type of experience they wanted to create for their end users, they realized that they needed to go with native development for each platform. This was iOS versus Android. So you really need to check it out, you need to prototype it, and you may be able to get away with it, and that can save you a lot of efficiency, but you are dependent on that cross-platform framework, how they maintain it, what they offer, instead of being able to go directly to the technical capabilities for app development that are offered for each operating system. And then beyond that, you also have to think about, well, once you deploy this to the field, what are the operational aspects? And it could be very simple things like, how within context of my app do I enable the user to connect to a Wi-Fi access point? This is a very common scenario. Most probably your app will be in kiosk mode, and with that, you take away the ability for the user to interact with Android settings. So you need to come up with a scheme that, if it's important for your use case and you need to connect to a different access point, that you make it available, because otherwise you're forcing technical engagement, even a truck roll, to be able to address that particular issue, which is not very economically viable. So this is something we also help you with Esper settings. It is something that you can add to your config when you provision your device. You can add it later on as well. And it's a nifty way to not touch your app, but yet offer a way for a user in a pinch to be able to interact with curated system settings, including Wi-Fi access points. So that way they can add these credentials and be good to go with minimal fuss and minimal touch by you. So think it through. What is your operational flow that you have going along with it, and what capabilities do you need to build into your overall solution that may be either in your app or capabilities that are outside of your app but are yet accessible in an appropriate manner. So now it comes down to a different set of choices depending on what your target technology stack is. And we'll start out at the top level, GMFS versus AOSB. We've talked about this before. And there's a bunch of different directions that this will go. Because if you do GMS, for one, you have a set of developer tech that you can utilize in your app that we won't go into here, but do you need that tech stack or not as part of your implementation? So this is things like Firebase, stuff like that. And then you have Google Play. And so in a way, you can look at it as a distribution point, because you can use Manage Google Play as a way to distribute your app in a private manner relative to your Esper endpoint, as we call it, your cloud instance. Or you can pull existing APKs that are up there on the Play Store that can serve your business purpose, right? So it is private apps, Play Store apps. And this is an interesting direction that if you have the ability to deliver your experience through a web property, you can create a web app through Managed Google Play as well. So some good options here. This one is kind of an interesting one because I think of it as like, how do you get to market quickly? And if you can use a Play Store app to be able to do it and it's acceptable for what your business use case is, fine. I don't think you typically see it in kiosk mode, which is like the next thing that we'll get to, kiosk. But if you need to do it in what we call multi-app mode with a home screen, and maybe you need a utility, analyze the Wi-Fi network at your deployment location, grabbing a Play Store app can be pretty good, and it's smooth through GMS. Private apps you can post and be able to use, but the web app is a great way for you to have your curated experience that you've already invested in that's delivered through a traditional website that is packaged in such a way that it can be presented in kiosk mode or in multi-app mode through your experience. Now, there is a detail here that a web app on GMS has a dependency to Chrome. And it literally means that you have to show Chrome on your home screen in order for the web app to function. It's not a problem if you're in kiosk mode because that Chrome shortcut is hidden behind the kiosk mode app. But if you have to go into multi-app mode, then Chrome is available and you have to look at things like how you apply a managed config. to be able to control, if you needed to, what could be done with getting access to Chrome. All right, so fairly straightforward, not a bad way to go. You jump over to the AOSP side, and this is, as we talked about before, greater control. But you have to be conscious that a lot of ISVs, including ISVs that build enterprise apps, and in some case, apps that are applicable for dedicated devices, that distribute through Google Play or basically make it available for private use, if you will, where you have to go to them to get it, have dependencies on the dev tech stack that exists on GMS. That means if you try to run it on an AOSP device, it won't work. And that means that you have to work with that ISV to remove those dependencies, make those trade-offs to get a build that will run on AOSP without GMS. So we've done that before. I would look at it that if you find an ISV app that exists on the GMS side, just talk to them, and if there's a business case, typically you can convince them to do a build for you that will run on AOSP. From an app distribution perspective, no Google Play, right? Doesn't exist over here, at least it shouldn't exist over here. And with that, that's where the Esper Cloud comes in. So think of it as like, you don't have to worry about having this app distribution infrastructure over on the GMS side, because we take care of it for you on the AOSP side. And by the way, it works over on the GMS side with precise control and is really built for the dedicated device use case. So now we get down to, well, what are you doing down here? And the concept of a private app or a Play Store app doesn't really exist, because basically you have the control to build and distribute your app through the Esper Cloud. The web app is an interesting one, because if you build a web app through Managed Google Play, it's only going to work on a GMS device. And you have the same type of, I guess I would say, imprecise distribution parameters associated with Google Play is brought down to the web app. And you have this Chrome dependency. But it's a really cool way to be able to do it, because it's super quick, it's great for prototyping, it's great for getting to market fast, getting that feedback loop going. So what we actually do is we have the ability to build web apps for our customers that is independent of Chrome. It actually uses Chromium, and it will run on AOSP and it will run on GMS. So this is the kind of thing, if you're exploring, come to us. We're working on productizing it a bit to make it more generally available, but right now, if a prospect or a customer comes to us and wants to try this out, we can generate the web app for you and you can give it a go. So you have this ability to do rapid prototyping that doesn't exist over on the GMS side to bring it to AOSP. We make that available to you. Now that brings me to Managed Config as another aspect of it. If you're not familiar with Managed Config, it's a way to provide basically a data payload that will configure an application based on that data payload. Of course, the app needs to support it, and you need to be able to push these parameters to the app. But a simple example is you can limit what websites Chrome can go to, the behavior of Chrome, and so Chrome supports Managed Config. Again, Managed Config, though, as it was conceived, is specific to GMS and Managed Google Play. So what we did is we genericized it and essentially created the ability to support Managed Config across GMS and AOSP. So that means from an app design perspective, if you're building an app that you need to work across both GMS and AOSP, you take into account that you can't use the dev tech stack that is specific to GMS, number one, but it does mean that you can utilize Managed Config to have fine-grained configuration of your app on either AOSP or GMS. Another detail to know that if you go the GMS route, you're going to be stuck with an atomic configuration. What I mean by that is if you use Managed Config, that means any app install for that app is going to utilize that Managed Config across your entire fleet. And that doesn't really fit the dedicated device scenario, because you think about the browser itself as an example. It may be that one customer needs a different configuration versus a different customer, but you're stuck with one. On our side, what we do is allow you to have fine-grained control of how you push out that Managed Config to an app where you can do it even at the device level, but certainly it's designed to work well at the group level. So if you group your devices properly, and that app instance being installed in that group can have a specific Managed Config for that particular group, for that particular customer, whatever your deployment scenario is. So that is really useful. Manage Config Plus, if you want to call it. And bringing this infrastructure over to AOSP as well. Now again, that means that you have to build your app to support Manage Config. It's not that hard to do, but it's something that you should think about because it gives you whatever knobs that you want to expose that you can programmatically control and change using Esper as the control mechanism to push out these data payloads in a fine-grained manner to whichever set of apps you wish to that are running on devices. Let's not leave out Android Studio, right? Where do you actually build apps? Well, it's pretty much Android Studio. And so this is a consideration for the actual developers building the app. And you can't ignore it. It's very important, and we don't ignore it. So one aspect of it is what we call the plugin for Esper. And plugin is the common kind of external third-party model where you can add capabilities to Android Studio. We have a plugin as well, and what it's designed to do is to ease the process of interacting with the Esper cloud so that as the app developer does their build process, they can upload it to our cloud and then trigger specific actions for that developer or that development team that you want to enable. So the easy scenario is the developer does a build, you have a test lab. Through this plugin, they can upload it to Esper with the credentials specific to them for their Esper cloud instance. And with that, they can trigger an automated rollout and installation, I guess, to the test lab. And that way, it's very easy to have a smooth flow to go from build to deployment to the test lab for the developer. And it's just as simple as uploading the APK using this plugin. Additionally, emulators. So it's very common to target an emulator when you're doing your app build. And Android Studio comes with a lot of emulators that are basically oriented at the GMS world. Of course, makes sense. That's the primary target. Most developers are building for GMS devices. What's generally missing is AOSP. So we actually have an emulator that you can install that lets you target AOSP. And so that way it makes it very straightforward to know, are you using anything that's GMS? Will it run? How will it work? And you don't actually need to have the target device in hand to be able to do it. So this gives you scalability because if you've ever gone through the process of like building a piece of hardware and enabling ISVs, one of the biggest pain points is the physical logistics and availability of the target hardware to get it into the hands of the application developers. And it's always the long pole in the tent, if you will. And through this method, you can just have them target an emulator. We do it generically for AOSP. We have one for our foundation build, but it's something that for customers, we can create a custom emulator if it makes sense for them and they want us to do it. And that way they can have a precise target for their app devs as they develop a new piece of hardware or have very specific design considerations from the OS perspective or even from the physical design. To give you an example, what if you have buttons that are non-standard because from a GMS perspective, let's say emergency call button or a programmable button, we've seen that before, you can do that on the AOSP side, but how the heck do you make that available to the app developer because you're going to have an SDK that exposes those buttons that the developer will program to. We can build that into an emulator and give you a smooth path to enable your app devs. Oh my gosh, I almost forgot Kiosk Mode. So let's talk about this a little bit. So you do have to think about what I would call the deployment mode of your app is. I talked a little bit about multi-app, and we have a lot of customers that do this, and it's primarily for the employee use case where you, through Esper, can set up which apps are made available for the user to be able to access. This is independent of GMS or AOSP, and it's essentially what shortcuts that we expose on the home screen with the launcher that we lock in that are made available to the end user. Furthermore, there's a lot of stuff that's in ROM, if you will, basically APKs that ship in the image that's built for the device. And we give you fine-grained control of that. By default, we just expose whatever apps you choose through your configuration. The other apps, if they're in ROM, will be running in the background, but you have the ability to disable them if you wish. Kind of the classic is cell broadcast receiver on cell phones because you don't want to get an Amber Alert hitting the phone in many cases. And so giving you a lot of fine-grained control there, but it may not be appropriate for you to have a home screen with different app choices, which is what you typically see in consumer-facing scenarios, whether it's a kiosk. It could also be employee-facing with the cash register. That's where Kiosk Mode comes in. And so basically what we're doing there is through Esper and our launcher, locking your app into a mode where it is the only app and it fills the screen. Very simplistic definition, but that's basically what it is. And so you do have to think about what it will look at if you have no notification bar, what are your navigation elements that you want to include. And so this is the nav bar at the bottom, and kind of how your app will sit there and how it will function. You also have to think about about the UI interface. Do you have nav bar? Are you doing swipe gestures with it? And the other thing is dynamicism here for navigation. So this goes back to foundation. In the AOSP world, you do see the general ability, in some cases, to be able to modify the presence of the nav bar. Some OEMs have SDKs that they give you that you can determine that behavior. In our Foundation OS, we make it dynamic through our device SDK, because with our device SDK, your app can literally decide when it wants to expose the nav bar and what elements of the nav bar that you want to make available to the user. So you have to kind of think it through, because you can create new types of experiences and UX flows using our device SDK that previously you weren't able to easily do traditionally with an Android app. That does take me to the device SDK, because this is another aspect for developers, where the device SDK is a set of APIs that relate to the capabilities of our Esper agent that are on the device. We have our cloud side, and we have a bunch of cloud APIs where you can fire device commands, and so this is to be able to drive your solution cloud to cloud API. But we also allow you to do it in situ of the app on the device itself. So it's things like, let's say you needed to configure an APN, your app can do it. Change the behavior of the nav bar on Esper Foundation. Your app has the capability to do that as well. So I encourage you to check out our device SDK and also the Foundation edition that has a few more capabilities with it. The device SDK is generally available for any devices that run on GMS or AOSP. There is a little linkage to the capability of the device. Obviously, setting an APN has a cellular dependency. There's a little variation across OEMs, but a lot of the commands or capabilities are solid across all the different devices that you get, with dependency on Android OS version. A lot of details there, but this is a very interesting thing for you to understand, because it can turbocharge your application and the type of experience that you're trying to create, because we're basically exposing to you our capabilities that we have in our Esper agent. Another area to consider is telemetry. So you are going to want your app to deliver a specific set of telemetry that you really need to think through. What are you looking for? App crashes, how the user interacts with the device. This isn't impacted by your choice of how you deploy your application initially. If you do a web app, you're going to have a lot less ability to be able to capture telemetry, and by the way, to interact with the system at large. Things like dealing with intent, stuff like that. It's cut off if you're using Chrome as your app that basically runs your web app. But if you don't care about that, it's okay. And so it's thinking about what you need on the telemetry side and what is your stack that you're going to use. So if you have hard requirements that are most easily serviced by Firebase, and you like the Firebase service in terms of how they deliver data, it's free, so it's very economical, then you're kind of stuck in the GMS world. If you're using Crashlytics and it's very important for you, it actually is available over on the AOSP side. And so really think about what telemetry you need to capture, what infrastructure you need to create, because you can also pipe that telemetry and build it into your app itself. There's a lot of third-party services that are available that do that for you. And then also, too, taking off the table some of the core OS telemetry, because we capture that for you. And you can get it via API through our cloud. And so you have to think about the combination of the stack up of the telemetry set and where you will get it, understanding that we give you advantage because a lot of the telemetry that you typically could not capture as a user level APK, we can get for you through Esper. Then that brings me to, I guess, a different kind of telemetry. It's not really telemetry, but once these devices are deployed to the field, how do you service them and interact with them? And so that comes back to the developer scenario, because it always sucks where you have a problem out in the field and the devices are like thousands of miles away. Generally speaking, developers don't like getting on planes unless they're for a dev conference. And so that's where some of our technology stacks comes into play. The first is being able to capture a bug report, right? Get your log cat, and we basically facilitate that for you through our infrastructure. If you're on a GMS device, you can capture it. It does require user permission to be able to send, same as actually true over on the AOSB side. That can be a little tricky if you're in kiosk mode, because when you're in kiosk mode, being able to respond to the notification isn't possible because you've disabled notification bar. And so it is a little bit trapezing that you need to do, because through Esper, which is really nice for service mode, if you will, you can remotely take the app out of kiosk mode. You can actually do it locally on the device with our Esper settings if you set it up that way. So you have multiple options to be able to handle this, but it is a bit of rigmarole because you have to take it out of kiosk mode, you have to get to that notification, and you have to send the bug report. But it's available, and so it's a nice option to be able to have, and you get your logcat, and you're on your way to solving your problem. Over on the AOSP side with Foundation, we actually make it seamless, so it's beautiful. You send a request for a bug report from Esper, bug report's generated, spits back to you, available for download through the Esper console, and you're on your way. So that's one aspect of it. The other is secure remote ADB. And so not only can you get a bug report, but you can actually do an ADB session to a device that is remotely deployed in the field. Again, kind of that AV thing where if you're in the standard GMS side and your typical AOSP device, you're going to have to do a bit of setup on the device. But once you complete that setup, you can do your ADB session. And by the way, that setup typically does not survive reboot. So it's not the kind of thing that you can configure at the factory and have it survive in the field, but it is an interesting option because arguably you see a lot of issues when you first deploy. And if you prepare these devices, at least a subset of them when they go out, you know it's sitting there and available for you initially out of the gate so that you can quickly go in with an ADB session and solve these problems. If you have a tech out in the field, they're certainly capable of setting in the device for the ADB session. And so that is always there for you. If you have to do a truck roll, you can basically set up secure remote ADB so that your developer back at home base can be able to debug the device. But with our Foundation OS, we have seamless secure remote ADB. So another thing of beauty, you can fire up an ADB session whenever you want. It also is taking into consideration the security aspects associated with exposing ADB. If you enable ADB basically for the proper USB port, because sometimes it's only one USB port on these dedicated devices, you can locally jack in and do your ADB session. Benefit for the local tech, but not so good if you are leaving that device exposed in the wild. So from a policy perspective, we control it. You can basically turn off ADB, and so that way you don't have to worry about it. And if you get into a particular situation where you need to do a secure remote ADB session, you turn it on and you pick your session duration, so that way if you forget to turn it off, you're not leaving it out there in the field. And then you can run your secure remote ADB session, do whatever actions or interaction with the device that you need to do, and you're good to go. All right, now we're going to get into some of the important minutiae, if you will, x86. So we have Foundation for x86. We see a growing demand for Android for dedicated devices on old x86. But it does have implications because the market is based on GMS ARM-based systems. And if you do a build through Android Studio, essentially what you're doing is you're building what's called an ABI, an application binary interface, and you can like slap me if I said that acronym, but I think that's right. And so you will get the ability to run it on different semiconductor architectures. So like ARM64, ARM32, which is starting to fade away, but also x86. Now the thing here is that occasionally an app dev is going to create their config, if you will, for their build so that they won't build it for x86. And so that means if you take your Android APK and you try to run on x86, it won't work. So the advice here is like, if you're doing x86, make sure that whoever is building the app understands that. If you're going on x86, GMFS does not exist. So by definition, it's an AOSP target. So make sure that you have your ducks lined up around targeting x86 because if you're getting an app from a third party, it may not work out of the gate. If you spec it up front and they know it, and by the way, you give them test hardware, which includes potentially an emulator that runs AOSP or Foundation into Android Studio with the precise target, this will not be a problem. The final point actually has to do with Google Play. Again, it goes back to the vast majority of application development is centered around consumers that want to payload via Google Play. And so Google is working to improve that experience and that process for app devs. And so it's things like taking ownership of the signing key for the app and being able to rotate it for you. It's things like doing app bundles, which is primarily designed for games. So that way you can just do a little small payload when you install the app. So that way the end user has an immediate great out-of-box experience of using the app instead of waiting for a 1 gigabyte file set to download. It just chunks it out and it progressively downloads it. So that way out of the gate, you're good to go. If you do either of these, it's not going to work for the dedicated scenarios. I was about to write dedicated, but it's bundles. So key point is do not optimize for Google Play if you're doing dedicated. Our system is designed to work with release key signing. We follow the previous Google Play Store conventions. And so sign with your release key, do not do an app bundle. It's going to work with Esper Cloud and other dedicated device app distribution methods just fine. But the consumer-driven approach that you see that's part of Google Play is typically not going to work for the dedicated space. So just be aware of that. No app bundles, sign with your release key yourself, good to go. I used to work at Microsoft and I was there during the Ballmer time of Windows, Windows, Windows. Well, you know what? It's actually apps, apps, apps. And by the way, they're Android apps. And so that is what this is all about. The app delivers your experience. It's a piece of the overall solution, but it is a very, very important one. We went through the considerations. Hope you enjoyed it. And at Esper, we're here for you. If you have any questions or are investigating building your app for a dedicated fleet and interested in the Esper infrastructure that we can provide, please do reach out to us. Thanks.